Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to this week's episode of Talking Therapy. In Talking Therapy, we deconstruct the themes from each week's episode of In Therapy, my YouTube series. And also, I give you the opportunity to ask me questions about the themes and the concepts which I'm sharing in the episodes. I created the series In Therapy, in this podcast Talking Therapy, to challenge the stigma around mental health, chronic illness, and quite honestly, the reality that we all go through challenging times in our lives. We all have periods where we struggle and we feel lost and we need help and support. It may also be that you're watching the series not because you're right now in a challenging time, but you're looking to optimize your life. You're looking to make your life the best it can be. And I think there'll be themes within the series that will be helpful in supporting you in that as well. In this first episode, we meet David. David has been suffering from depression and self-esteem issues for many years. And I think it's incredibly brave of David to have come and be willing to participate in this series.
You know, I still think people are judged for the way they feel, or for talking about the way they feel, or for coming forward and sort of saying, look, I'm not very happy at the moment, you know. And I think that's especially true of men. Coming from where I do, I think there is that kind of culture that, you know, boys don't cry, you know, and it's for want of a better term, you know, it's that sort of, you know, you don't talk about your emotions and you don't talk about the way you're feeling, you don't talk about feeling depressed.
It's quite shocking to realize that only 36% of referrals for psychological therapies are from men. That doesn't mean that men don't suffer and don't need help and support. Actually, what the data shows us is men are just less likely to ask for help. In fact, the statistics on homelessness and on suicide are much higher in men. Really, one of the key themes of this series: we all struggle, we all suffer, we all go through challenging times in our lives. What makes things worse is not talking about what's happening and what's going on for us. But In Therapy is about more than just talking. It's also about practical tools and practical strategies to help support creating lasting change. And that's some of where we're going to be going with David in the episodes. In this first episode, towards the end, you'll see me using an exercise called Wheel of Life. And in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the questions that you guys have been asking about that. So before we go into questions specifically related to David's first episode, we've also had a number of questions about how do we find people to participate in the series? What does that application process look like? What are the steps we go through? Also, how do we balance the needs of the series with the duty of care of the people which I'm working with? So I should say that this is pretty much the first time that I've seen a series like this being created. That's part of what makes it very exciting for us as a production team. But it also comes with its challenges, and it's certainly not a perfect science. I think we're learning and evolving the process as we go. But the first thing is we need to find potential people that are interested. And as you can imagine, that's probably harder than it might sound. It's one thing for people to be willing to go on a therapeutic journey. It's another thing for someone to be willing to go on a therapeutic journey with cameras around them, knowing that what they're sharing is going to be shared in a public forum. Also, we don't film the kind of whole therapeutic journey and then at the end of that, start editing episodes to release them. We're normally filming a couple of months ahead of the episodes that you're seeing. Sometimes it's a bit less. But people really are placing their trust in that journey and in that process. So for the first series, we found people by putting out a video on my YouTube channel, and we had a actually surprising number of people applying to be part of it. And the three people that we decided to start working with were all people that had had a little bit of contact in some way with the teams at the Optimum Health Clinic. So we were sort of familiar a bit with their stories and felt they would be a good fit for the series. One of the challenges was making sure we tried to have a bit of a variety in terms of people's sort of backgrounds and the issues that they would be looking to work with, whilst also having people that could travel to the studio here in London. Although, of course, the coronavirus did have some other plans. That's why a lot of the first season ended up being filmed on Zoom video. For this second season, we wanted to cast the net a little bit wider. We also wanted to work with a more diverse range of issues. We wanted to move beyond just chronic health conditions to also things like depression, anxiety, addictions, and so on. So we placed some adverts on social media, and we had a member of the team that was actively sort of doing reach out, trying to find people through that. It was also mentioned on my social media. We also put something out in my newsletter, which goes out to quite a large number of people. And we had a range of people which applied. Again, it comes back to one of our challenges of really trying to have a diverse range of people. We really wanted to have a man as part of this series. We were very keen to have more diversity in terms of ethnic backgrounds, and we haven't been as successful so far with that as we hope, but that's something we're very keen to progress with in the future. Also, having people that are at a certain place in their lives where they really feel kind of alive in their desire and their wish for things to change. There's often a sweet spot in that therapeutic journey where if you get someone too early, sometimes there's a sense of just hoping things will go back to normal, and there's sometimes less willingness to do that inner work. Sometimes when people have been in a very dark place for a very long time, sometimes a more substantial support structure than we feel able to provide may also be necessary. So there's a certain sort of sweet spot in terms of what's appropriate, we think, to participate in the series. We're then also trying to have a range of different backgrounds, a range of different issues that people want to work on. So we actually had a number of great applications for season 2 of people that I would have loved to have worked with as part of the series, but we felt the themes they wanted to work on had already been covered a lot in season 1. And we're really trying to have variety, as I say, in terms of what we're working with. So the next step, once we've had applications, is we need to assess beyond whether someone's a fit from a story perspective for the series. We also need to assess their suitability to go through what, as I've mentioned, is a very vulnerable process like this. Where they're people that have already worked in some capacity with some of the practitioner teams at the Optimum Health Clinic, it may be that alone we can do an assessment that way. Anybody that is not known to us in that way, which is true of the applicants that ended up progressing into season 2, one of the things they have to do is a psychological assessment. So Dr. Gary Lee, who's a chartered psychologist who I work alongside, has done a psychological assessment. And the idea of that is a few things. It's firstly to make sure that people don't have mental health issues that may require, let's say, a more involved process than we're able to provide here. Making sure people haven't got severe mental illness or personality disorders, things like that. But also ensuring people understand what it is that they're going to be participating in and that they really are happy to go through that process. Once people have passed those stages, as you can see, this is quite involved, they then have some in-depth conversations with Oliver and Rachel, who are the producers on the series. And they will talk to them about much more of what's involved in the filming, that we'd like people to do video diaries as they go through the series, about how there's obviously going to be cameras in there, what that might be like. So there's a lot of process, let's say, that we go through. And it really is, I think it's a real balance for us to find of ultimately my intention of working with people therapeutically is to be of the greatest value to their therapeutic process. And yet we're also balancing that with ensuring that we're meeting the needs of the series, that we have people that are going to hopefully be engaging to the viewing audience, that therapeutically I'm having a variety of different themes that I'm working with. We have people doing all the same therapeutic work. It makes it, I think, less interesting for the viewing audience. We also then film the first few sessions before we release any episodes, because that allows us to make sure that someone really is happy with the process. And in this season, in the first season, we actually had one person drop out after the first few sessions. That happened again in this season, that someone filmed a few sessions and we got into some quite delicate material, and they decided that quite late out that actually this wasn't something that they were going to be comfortable with doing. We also had someone come to the first day of filming and suddenly get more of a sense of what was involved and again decided to withdraw. So we're really, I think, really doing our best to make sure that participating in this series is not a price that someone pays to do therapeutic work with me, but actually what we're hoping, and certainly the feedback has been from season 1, that it's actually enhanced people's therapeutic journey. Particularly you guys posting such supportive comments. The participants often, I think, are reading those comments, and that's acting as a real support to them. There's also, I think, an element of accountability, of someone knowing that people are following their journey, they're invested in their journey. And sometimes we all know that we commit to doing something and then that commitment to ourselves can sometimes flounder a bit. But if we know that there's number of people that are invested in us, I think that can also sometimes be a powerful support. So far, the people in season 1 have been very, very positive about their experience of being part of the series. And the people we've started with in season 2 have also been positive. We've decided that we're going to have a rolling recruitment for the series, which means that if we find people which we think are the right fit in all the ways that I've just been talking about, we may well start filming with some new people as the series is unfolding as well. So if you're interested in potentially joining, being part of In Therapy, you can email hello@alexhoward.com and Oliver and Rachel can be in touch with more details about how you can potentially become part of the series. So in this section of the podcast, I wanted to answer some of the questions that you, the viewing audience, have been asking. And to be clear, these are questions from the In Therapy episodes on YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast on one of the podcasting platforms, you can go to YouTube and search In Therapy with Alex Howard, and you'll find the series that way. Firstly, I want to say in response to David's first episode, there have been a number of really positive and supportive comments. And firstly, I really appreciate that. But also, I filmed a session with David last week, and it was the day after the first episode was released. And he'd also read some of those comments and very much appreciated it. So firstly, thank you very much for that. So the first question I'm going to answer today is from City. And City says, "Wonderful new episode." Thank you. And David seems like a really authentic and nice guy. Alex, for the podcast, I was wondering if you could talk about what depression actually is and maybe different types of depression. I feel like there are many misconceptions about it. So City, thank you for your question. And yes, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about depression. And the first thing that I would say is depression is a word. It's a label that describes a whole myriad of different experiences and feelings and conditions that people can experience. And I think there is value and benefit, of course, in giving things labels, because labels allow us to talk about things in ways that we understand what it is that we're talking about. But I think we also have to remember that people's lived experience is firstly often much more than those labels, but also people have very different experiences of the same thing. So one way of talking about depression is a certain state of mind and emotions and body through which we experience the world. A way you could think about it is we all have lenses, we all have ways through which we perceive reality, and the lens that we use determines how the world looks, determines how we feel, and often determines the experiences that we have. One of the ways that people experience depression is the lens through which they see the world is one which feels negative. And one of the cliched ways of talking about it is the glass half full or half empty? And if we feel depressed, we notice what's missing. It's like the world feels like a place which doesn't feel positive, doesn't feel uplifting. In cognitive behavioral therapy, depression's often talked about of the 3 Ps. That our life obviously feels negative, but that feels permanent, like it's always going to be that way. It feels pervasive, like all of our life is affected by it. And it feels personal, like it's happening to us. Another way of thinking about it is depression is a state and memory is state dependent. When we're in a particular state, we tend to access the memories that resonate and correlate with that state. So for example, let's say that we have a really wonderful experience with our family. Coming up to Christmas, this may not be something many people are thinking about, but let's say that you have a family birthday and it's one of those like peak experiences in family where just for that hour or that afternoon, everyone seems to be getting on amazingly well. In that moment, we remember all of the things that we love about our family. We remember all the other positive memories. We think about the future, all the things that we're looking forward to. We have a certain state and we have a certain frame through which we're seeing family. And then let's say a little bit later, we start to get into the more murky, slippery stuff. And let's say we have an argument with a family member. We find ourselves exploding and being angry and being frustrated and being pissed off. We suddenly start to access all of the memories of all of the negative experiences we had around family. Remember the times where people have said unkind things to us, the times that we felt alone, the times we've seen other people's families as being more happy, more loving. So the state that we are in determines a lot. It determines the memories we access. It determines the lens through which we look at, through which we perceive the world. And depression is often a result of being in a state which has become conditioned and trained into our body, into our system. In a sense, it's a pattern. It's a learnt pattern that we've got conditioned and caught into. The question then becomes, well, how do people get trained into different patterns of depression? And to answer City's question a bit more, there are different types of depression. Put another way, there are different triggers for someone to go into a period of depression. This is not a comprehensive list, but some examples of what that might be. It might be an event-driven depression. So it might be there's a series of short-term events that have happened in someone's life, often that feel overwhelming. It's like it's a boat that if it has a few loads on it, it can sort of maintain floating and it's fine. But the more loads you pile on, before a while, it becomes too much and the boat starts taking on water, it starts sinking, and then before you know it, it becomes less and less resilient and less resourceful. So sometimes we might go through a series of overwhelming events. And if we look at David's story, some of the challenges that he's experienced in the last year. In the last year, his dad has died, and his dad passed away in a quite traumatic way, I think, as a result of COVID. He could only say goodbye by wading through a window. He's lost several friends to suicide. His cat died. He's had some difficulty in terms of where he's living and moving and not being entirely happy with some of that. So there's been a series of events that have become like loads on that boat, which then going back to when we're depressed or when we're in any particular state, it's not just true of depression, we start to access the other memories that make us feel that way. Our state starts to shift and we get conditioned into a certain pattern of thinking. So that's event-triggered depression. We can also have a mindset-driven depression. We get conditioned to a certain mindset where we start looking for the things in our life that are not working. We start looking for the problems. We start focusing on the problems. It's just like there's a part of our mind called our reticular activating system. And this part of our mind is trained to look for habits and look for patterns. That's why if you get a new car and you suddenly start seeing that model of car everywhere you're going, or when, let's say, you find out you're pregnant or your partner's pregnant, you suddenly start to see babies everywhere. That part of our brain is trained to look for patterns. When we're looking for what's wrong, when we're looking for what's not working, we often find that we can see that. So that's another example of a type of depression, mindset-driven depression. There's also trauma-induced depression. We've had a series of traumas over a sustained period of time. And the emotions of that have not been processed. They're locked in our body. They've not been metabolized. And so something happens and we have a trigger, and suddenly all of these unprocessed feelings start to get triggered and start to come up. So when it comes to working with someone that's suffering from depression, the first thing is we need to actually diagnose what type of depression is this? What are the variables and factors that are going on? Because that allows us to then start to put together a program that can help us start to address that. Our second question comes from Sarah. Sarah asks, after watching David's video, I was wondering if you wake up in the morning and you already feel especially low, you feel sad and wounded and stuck, but you know you have certain things to do in this day. Is there anything you can do or tell yourself that will help you get through the day? Is there any kind of self-talk that can help? David, good luck with your journey. It's really brave what you're doing. So firstly, thank you, Sarah, for your question. I think it's a really good question. And often people ask me what I think about positive affirmations, what I think about positive thinking. And I have what I think is perhaps a slightly controversial opinion around some of these things. I think they can be helpful and they do have their place. But I think the temptation can sometimes be that when we feel low or we feel depressed or we feel flat, that we think the solution is just that we have to think more positively. But one way of thinking about it is often positive thinking in of itself is unsustainable. Think about it like this. If you have a stock in the stock market which is overvalued, it's disproportionately inflated, what goes up must come down. And if we're trying to force our mood into an unsustainable positive place, often our mood will come collapsing back down again. Now, it's true to say that if we're being very negative, a shift from negative towards realistic might be sustainable. But trying to go from realistic to positive is a little bit like trying to overinflate or overvalue something in the stock market. It's hard to sustain it in that place, which is why I'm not a big supporter of positive thinking as an idea. What I think is often much more helpful is to really work to get to the crux, to get to the core of what it is that's really going on. As I talked about in the answer to the CT's question, the previous question, if we've got mental patterns of thinking like mindset-driven depression, we need to figure out what those patterns are. We need to learn to challenge and to shift and change those patterns of thinking. If we've had event-driven depression, we need to understand what are those events, how have they impacted us, how are we experiencing those in the kind of current day-to-day experience of our life. This is why in the session with David, at one point he says to me,
I want to change my life, I'm not sure how.
And I say to him, we'll get there, but first we need to start with what. What's actually going on? What's at the core of what's happening? And then why? Where does it come from? What's the context? What's the history? We can then come to the how. How do we change it? So in answer to your question, Sarah, yes, there can be a place for positive affirmations or self-talk. But I think what's often more helpful as a starting point is understanding what's going on that's causing you to wake up in the morning and feel low and to feel sad and to feel wounded and stuck. Why is that happening? And then we can get into the how of how we actually change it. We also have had some questions that have been emailed in. And if you'd like to email a question, if you prefer not to post on the comments on YouTube, you can always email hello@alexhoward.com. So the first question is, how do I do the Wheel of Life exercise? So what we're doing is when I set exercises to the participants in therapy, we're creating some resources to help you come along on the journey to do the exercises at home. And we're doing them as posts on my Instagram account. So if you head over to my Instagram, you might have to go a little bit back in the timeline. You'll find an image of the Wheel of Life, and then you'll be able to see a carousel, a series of photos that go with that walk you through how to do the exercise. The final question we have for today is, I did the Wheel of Life, but I feel worse because my scores were so low. What should I do? So sometimes we do the Wheel of Life, and what we take from it, often what we take from it, is we notice some areas of our life are really good. And it turns out to be true for David. Things like friends and certain parts of his life feel really good. But other areas can feel really low. Sometimes we can be surprised that more areas of our life feel low than perhaps we thought. What's often the case as well, one of the insights people often get from doing this exercise, is the areas of our life we focus on tend to be scored more highly than the areas of our life that we don't put attention on. So let's say, for example, we really work hard on our career. Our career may be an 8 out of 10, but perhaps that's been at the expense of our friendships or our hobbies or our relationship. So it's a very helpful exercise to make sense of whereabouts in our life do we need to put more attention. But if what you find is you're surprised at how low the scores are, there's a couple of things that I want to point out. One, it may actually be the case that that's how things are, and that is important information to start to work on changing those areas. As much as I'm into talking about the struggles and the suffering and the difficulties we experience in life, my goal is not that people then live in that place. We need to have awareness, but we then need to have the tools and the strategy to create change. So this may be about having a reality check to go, I actually need to put some effort and energy into creating change in my life. The second thing is just check in with, where are you scoring these areas from? What sometimes happens is the inner critic, that's that voice inside of our mind, which is always judging us and criticizing us and beating us up and telling us we're not enough or whatever else. And it's a theme that we'll explore more on in therapy. Sometimes it's our inner critic that's asking the questions, and we're actually being really unfair and hard and critical towards ourselves. And perhaps taking away the judgments of your inner critic, you may find that actually you score the areas much more highly than you previously thought. So thank you so much for sharing your questions. We're going to do a lot more of this on Talking Therapy. In fact, this is one of the main reasons that we decided to create the podcast, that I really feel it allows us to be more interactive as opposed to you just passively watching the videos. So thank you for those of you that have either emailed in questions or posted the questions below the videos on YouTube. We're going to keep doing this in Talking Therapy, so if you've got questions, the best place to post them to ensure that we see them is on the most recent episode of In Therapy on YouTube. So when you go to YouTube, you can go to my YouTube channel, you can search Alex Howard In Therapy. You can find the most recent episode of In Therapy, post your questions there. Questions either related to that episode or indeed previous episodes, and I look forward to answering more of your questions. Thank you for watching or listening to this week's episode of Talking Therapy. If you want to find out more about me and my work, you can go to my website, alexhoward.com. You can sign up for a free 3-part video series, which goes much deeper into my work and ideas. Next week on Talking Therapy, we're going to be exploring some of the themes and questions that come up from David's second episode of In Therapy. You can find that on my YouTube channel now. I look forward to talking with you next week.